In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, as the largest armada in human history approached the beaches of Normandy, Adolf Hitler remained asleep in his Alpine retreat, confident that the real Allied invasion would come elsewhere. 200 miles away, German tanks sat idle near the Pas de Calais, their commanders convinced by intelligence reports that Normandy was merely a diversion. This catastrophic miscalculation wasn't the result of military genius or superior Allied technology. It was the masterwork of a single man who had never fired a shot in anger, never worn a uniform with pride, and whose greatest weapon was an imagination so vivid it could conjure entire armies from thin air. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia, and he was perhaps the greatest liar in the history of warfare. To the British, he was Agent Garbo, a code name that would prove prophetic, for like the legendary actress, he performed the role of his lifetime. To the Germans, he was their most trusted spy in Britain, a fanatical Nazi willing to risk everything for the Führer's vision of a 1,000-year Reich. In reality, he was a Spanish chicken farmer whose hatred of fascism burned so fiercely that he created 27 fictional spies, convinced an entire intelligence apparatus that phantom armies were massing across England, and single-handedly changed the course of World War II. This is the story of how one man's web of lies became the Allies' most powerful weapon, and how the spy who fooled Hitler saved D-Day. The story begins not in the smoke-filled rooms of military intelligence, but in the dusty streets of Barcelona on February 14, 1912. Juan Pujol Garcia was born into a world on the precipice of chaos, the third child of Juan Pujol, a Catalan industrialist who owned a dye factory, and Mercedes Garcia Guijarro, a woman from Andalusia whose gentle nature would profoundly shape her son's moral compass. The Barcelona of Juan's youth was a city of contrasts. Wealthy merchants' children played in tree-lined boulevards, while workers' families crowded into tenements that reeked of industrial chemicals. The Pujol family occupied a comfortable middle ground, prosperous enough to send Juan to decent schools, but not wealthy enough to shield him from the political turmoil that was beginning to tear Spain apart. Juan was an unusual child, dreamy, introspective, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to spin elaborate tales. His teachers noted that while he struggled with mathematics and science, he could weave stories so convincing that even adults found themselves drawn into his fictional worlds. This gift for narrative would lie dormant for years, waiting for history to provide a stage grand enough for his talents. The Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936 like a dress rehearsal for the global catastrophe to come. Juan, now 24 and managing a chicken farm near the French border, found himself conscripted into a conflict that would define his political awakening. What happened next would become part of Garbo legend. Juan served on both sides of the war, switching allegiances not out of opportunism, but out of a desperate desire to avoid actually killing anyone. First, he joined Franco's nationalist forces, working as a radio operator while secretly planning his escape. When the opportunity arose, he deserted and crossed into Republican territory, where he was imprisoned, interrogated, and eventually released. By war's end in 1939, Juan had managed to fight for both sides without firing a single bullet, a feat that required not just luck, but the kind of elaborate deception that would later make him legendary. The war's end left Juan politically awakened and morally clear-eyed. He had seen fascism up close, its casual brutality, its worship of power, its contempt for human dignity. When Hitler's armies swept across Europe in 1940, Juan felt the same revulsion he had experienced during the Spanish Civil War, but magnified 1,000-fold. France had fallen, Britain stood alone, and Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. It was then that Juan Pujol Garcia made a decision that would echo through history. He would offer his services to the British as a spy. What followed was a comedy of errors that nearly ended before it began. In January 1941, Juan approached the British embassy in Madrid, offering to spy against Germany. His earnest proposal was met with polite dismissal. The British, overwhelmed by refugees and dubious offers of assistance, saw nothing remarkable in this Spanish chicken farmer. They had more pressing concerns than entertaining the fantasies of would-be spies. Juan tried again in Lisbon, this time enlisting his wife Araceli to make the approach. Again, rejection. The British, it seemed, had no use for amateur enthusiasm. But Juan possessed something rarer than courage. He had vision. If the British wouldn't accept his help directly, he would find another way. In a move that revealed both his strategic thinking and his appetite for risk, Juan decided to get himself recruited by the Germans first. He would become a Nazi spy, gain their trust, and then offer his services to the British not as an amateur volunteer, but as a proven operative with access to German intelligence networks. In early 1941, Juan walked into the German embassy in Madrid and delivered a performance worthy of the theater. He presented himself as a Spanish government official with fanatical pro-Nazi sympathies, a man who traveled frequently to London on official business and burned with desire to serve the Reich. His backstory was elaborate, his enthusiasm convincing, and his timing perfect. The Germans were desperate to establish intelligence networks in Britain. After some hesitation, they accepted him. Juan was given a crash course in espionage, secret writing techniques, radio procedures, dead letter drops, and the elaborate protocols of intelligence work. His instructions were clear: travel to Britain, establish himself, and begin recruiting a network of agents who could provide the Reich with the intelligence it desperately needed about British military preparations. Instead of boarding a ship to England, Juan took his family to Lisbon and began the most audacious intelligence operation of the war. Armed with nothing but a blue guide to England, some reference books about the Royal Navy, and magazines from the local library, he began creating intelligence reports that appeared to come from London, but were actually composed in a Lisbon apartment. For 9 months, Juan lived a double life. To his German handlers, he was Arabel, their most productive agent in Britain. To his wife and neighbors, he was simply a Spanish expatriate trying to make a living in wartime Portugal. But in the secrecy of his study, he was something else entirely. He was becoming Agent Garbo, though he didn't know it yet. The reports he sent to Germany were masterpieces of calculated deception. Juan invented a network of sub-agents, each with detailed biographies and distinct personalities. There was the Venezuelan student in Glasgow who would do anything for a liter of wine, a mistake that revealed Juan had never actually visited Scotland, where wine was less popular than whiskey. There was the Portuguese businessman named Carvalho, the Swiss watchmaker Gerbers, and a man from Gibraltar known only as Fred. Each fictional agent provided specific intelligence about British military preparations, shipping movements, and defensive positions. The information was carefully crafted to be plausible but misleading, detailed enough to convince but timed to arrive too late to be militarily useful. Juan had intuited one of the fundamental principles of deception: the most convincing lies are built on foundations of partial truth. By February 1942, Juan's elaborate charade had achieved something remarkable. It had attracted the attention of British intelligence, not because they recognized his brilliance, but because they had been reading German radio traffic through the Ultra program and noticed an unusual pattern. A German agent named Arabel was sending an extraordinary volume of intelligence from Britain, but much of it was inaccurate or suspiciously timed. The British began to investigate. Who was this prolific but problematic agent? Where were his reports actually originating? And most intriguingly, was he deliberately misleading the Germans? The investigation led them to Lisbon, to a Spanish expatriate who claimed to be a Nazi spy, but whose reports suggested something else entirely. On April 24, 1942, Juan Pujol Garcia stepped off a boat in Plymouth and into the most secret war within the war. Waiting for him on the dock were 2 men who would change his life: Cyril Mills and Thomas Harris, both officers in MI5, Britain's security service. Harris, in particular, would become Juan's partner in one of the most elaborate deceptions in military history. Thomas Harris was himself a study in contrasts and art dealer and painter who spoke fluent Spanish and possessed an imagination almost as vivid as Juan's. The official history of British intelligence would later describe their partnership as one of those rare partnerships between two exceptionally gifted men whose inventive genius inspired and complemented each other. Juan was immediately inducted into the double-cross system, Britain's most secret program for turning captured German agents into double agents. The system, run by the 20 Committee, so named because the Roman numeral 20 resembled a double cross, had achieved something unprecedented. Every single German agent who had landed in Britain had been captured and turned. Under Harris's guidance, Juan's fictional network exploded in complexity and scope. His original 5 agents multiplied to 27, each with elaborate backstories, personal quirks, and specialized areas of intelligence gathering. There was Agent 3, the Venezuelan student in Glasgow, whose love of wine had already amused British intelligence officers. Agent 4 became Fred, a waiter from Gibraltar who claimed to work in the Chislehurst caves where an underground arms depot was supposedly located. Perhaps most audacious was Agent 7, whom Juan described as a Welsh nationalist leading a fascist group called the Brothers of the Aryan World Order in Swansea. This fictional character allowed Juan to report on British military activities in Wales while maintaining his cover as a fanatical Nazi sympathizer. The communication between Juan and his German handlers was a work of art. Between 1942 and 1944, Juan and Harris wrote 315 letters to Madrid, averaging 2,000 words each. The letters were written in Juan's established verbose style, flowery, dramatic, and filled with Nazi rhetoric that made German intelligence officers believe they had found their most dedicated agent in Britain. By 1943, the Germans trusted Juan so completely that they provided him with radio equipment and their most sensitive codes. This was the ultimate validation. Radio communication was reserved for only the most valuable agents, and the Germans were now transmitting to Juan 4 times daily. What they didn't know was that the radio operator was Charles Haynes, a British ham radio enthusiast who was recording every German transmission and sending back carefully crafted responses. In January 1944, the war entered its most critical phase. The Germans sent Juan a message that would define his legacy. They believed the Allies were preparing for a large-scale invasion of Europe and looked to him to keep them informed of developments. This was the moment Juan and Harris had been preparing for the chance to deploy their network of fictional agents in support of the greatest military deception in history. Operation Fortitude was the Allied plan to mislead the Germans about the location and timing of the D-Day invasion. The actual landing would take place at Normandy, but the Germans had to be convinced that the main assault would come at the Pas de Calais, 150 miles to the northeast. The deception required creating an entire phantom army, the first U.S. Army Group FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton and massing in Kent and Essex for an assault on Calais. Juan's network of imaginary agents became the eyes and ears of this phantom army. His fictional Venezuelan student in Glasgow reported on massive troop movements heading south. His Welsh fascist provided intelligence about American units arriving in Wales. Agent 4, still working in his imaginary job at the Chislehurst caves, described vast weapon stockpiles being moved to the southeast coast of England. The reports were masterfully crafted, providing just enough accurate information to maintain credibility while painting a completely false picture of Allied intentions. Juan described convoy movements that had actually occurred, but timed his reports to arrive after the ships had reached their destinations. He reported on military exercises that the Germans could verify through aerial reconnaissance, but described them as preparations for an assault on Calais rather than Normandy. Between January and June 1944, Juan transmitted over 500 radio messages to Madrid, each one carefully designed to reinforce the deception. The Germans were so impressed by the quality and quantity of his intelligence that they increased his salary and began planning to award him their highest decoration for foreign agents. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, Juan Pujol Garcia faced the ultimate test of his elaborate deception. The largest invasion force in history was approaching the beaches of Normandy, but the Germans still believed the real attack would come at Calais. Everything depended on maintaining that illusion, even as Allied troops waded ashore in France. The night before the invasion, Juan was scheduled to transmit a crucial message to his German handlers at 3 a.m., a warning that major Allied movements were underway. But when he attempted to make contact, no one answered. The German radio operator had failed to keep the scheduled appointment, missing what would have been the most important intelligence of the war. The irony was perfect. Juan's warning, carefully crafted to arrive too late to prevent the invasion, but early enough to enhance his credibility, went unheard. When the Germans realized what they had missed, their respect for their British agent increased even more. Juan sent an angry message expressing his disgust at their negligence. "I cannot accept excuses or negligence. Were it not for my ideals, I would abandon the work." But Juan's masterpiece was yet to come. On June 9th, 3 days after the landings, he transmitted perhaps the most important message of his career. It was long, detailed, and supposedly based on a meeting with all his agents. The message was urgent. Juan insisted it must be conveyed immediately to the German High Command. The message was devastating in its deceptive power. Juan reported that the first U.S. Army group under Patton remained in southeast England, untouched by the Normandy operations. The landings, he explained, were clearly a diversion designed to draw German forces away from the real invasion site. The main assault, he reported with complete authority, was still coming at the Pas de Calais. The German High Command accepted Juan's assessment completely. Throughout July and August 1944, they kept 2 armored divisions and 19 infantry divisions in the Pas de Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. These forces could have tipped the balance in Normandy, where the Allies were struggling to establish their beachhead. Instead, they sat idle, victims of one man's extraordinary imagination. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander-in-chief, was so convinced by Juan's intelligence that he overruled General Erwin Rommel's proposal to move troops from Calais to Normandy. As the official history of British intelligence later noted, their intervention in the Normandy battle really might have tipped the balance. On July 29, 1944, Juan received the ultimate validation of his deception. A message from his German handlers informed him that the Führer himself had awarded him the Iron Cross for his extraordinary services to Germany. Juan and Harris responded with characteristic humility, expressing Garbo's humble thanks for an honor for which he was truly unworthy. The irony was sublime. Juan Pujol Garcia, whose hatred of fascism had driven him to create his elaborate deception, had been decorated by Adolf Hitler himself. At the same time, the British were preparing to award him the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, for his services to the Allied cause. Juan may be the only person in history to have been decorated by both sides in World War II. In September 1944, British intelligence learned that Juan's cover might be blown. Rather than risk exposure, they decided he should disappear. With MI5's help, Juan faked his death from malaria in Angola in 1949, then slipped away to begin a new life in Venezuela. To the world, Juan Pujol Garcia was dead. In reality, he was running a bookstore and gift shop in Lagunillas, living in the anonymity he had craved after years of living multiple lives. For 35 years, Juan's story remained classified. The man who had changed the course of World War II lived quietly in South America, his extraordinary achievements known only to a handful of intelligence officers who took their secrets to the grave. His handler, Thomas Harris, was killed in a car crash in Majorca in 1964, taking many details of their partnership with him. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Juan emerged from the shadows. He traveled to Normandy to pay his respects to the men who had died on the beaches he had helped liberate through deception rather than force. The sight of the elderly Spanish bookstore owner walking among the graves was deeply moving. Here was a man whose lies in service of truth had saved thousands of lives. Juan published his memoirs in 1985, finally revealing the full scope of his wartime activities. The book, Operation Garbo, became an international sensation, introducing the world to one of history's most remarkable secret agents. Juan's story inspired documentaries, academic studies, and countless articles about the hidden war of deception that had been as crucial as any battlefield victory. He died in Caracas on October 10, 1988, at the age of 76, following a stroke. His death was noted in the world's major newspapers, but the tribute seemed inadequate for a man whose imagination had helped shape the modern world. He was buried in Venezuela, far from the England where he had created his masterpiece of deception, and equally far from the Spain where his hatred of fascism had first been kindled. In the years since Juan's death, historians have come to fully appreciate the magnitude of his achievement. The double-cross system, of which he was the crown jewel, represents one of the most successful intelligence operations in history. But Juan's contribution went beyond intelligence. He had demonstrated that in an age of mechanized warfare and industrial killing, the human imagination remained warfare's most powerful weapon. The fictional network Juan and Harris created was more than just a deception operation. It was a work of collaborative art, a sustained creative performance that spanned 3 years and encompassed hundreds of characters, thousands of messages, and millions of carefully chosen words. Each fictional agent was brought to life through meticulous attention to detail, psychological insight, and narrative consistency that would have impressed professional novelists. Juan's legacy extends beyond World War II into the modern age of information warfare. His techniques creating false identities, manipulating information flows, exploiting enemy assumptions have become standard tools of intelligence agencies worldwide. In an era where reality itself seems increasingly malleable, Juan Pujol Garcia stands as both pioneer and prophet of the age of strategic deception. But perhaps Juan's most important legacy is moral rather than tactical. At a time when the world's great powers were mobilizing millions of soldiers and spending vast fortunes on weapons of destruction, one man armed with nothing but imagination and moral conviction changed the course of history. Juan proved that in the great struggles between democracy and authoritarianism, truth and lies, freedom and oppression, individual courage and creativity can tip the balance. The beaches of Normandy stand today as monuments to the courage of the men who stormed ashore on D-Day. But they are also monuments to the power of the human imagination, embodied in the extraordinary figure of Juan Pujol Garcia, the Spanish chicken farmer who became Agent Garbo, the spy who fooled Hitler, and the man whose lies in service of truth helped liberate a continent. In the end, perhaps that is Juan's greatest achievement. He proved that in the darkest of times, when evil seems ascendant and hope appears lost, ordinary people can still change the world. They need not be soldiers or statesmen, scientists or philosophers. Sometimes they need only be storytellers, armed with imagination, conviction, and the courage to make their stories matter. As we face our own age of uncertainty, when democracy again seems fragile and authoritarianism resurgent, Juan Pujol Garcia's story reminds us that the most powerful weapons in the arsenal of freedom are not tanks or missiles, but ideas and ideals, creativity and conviction, and the unshakable belief that individual actions, however small they may seem, can echo through history and shape the destiny of nations. This is why we remember Juan Pujol Garcia, not just as a spy or a war hero, but as proof that in the great struggles that define human history, Victory often belongs not to the strongest or the most numerous, but to those with the courage to imagine a better world and the determination to make that imagination reality.